Well, it's an important question and it deserves a good answer. The problem we've had historically, certainly since the end of the Second World War, is the widespread illusion that our power was limitless, whether it was economic, military, or political influence. America's reach was unending. This, of course, was never true. At the end of the Second World War, we were really the last man standing. Virtually everyone else who had been in the war was severely damaged, and that put us considerably ahead of everyone else. But most Americans don't think in those terms. They simply see this great colossus bestriding the world. The truth is that we're discovering the limits of our capabilities, our resources, and most important, our financial limits. We have this terrible sovereign national debt, which for years people have insisted was meaningless. Oh, debt doesn't matter anymore was one of the favorite phrases, but it's beginning to matter as it has for 5,000 years. And we face a very difficult situation now, not just with debt, but also the interest rate problem in our efforts to fight inflation. And the higher the interest rates go, the less and less our bonds are worth. And the more money we print, the more we debase our currency. So we're reaching a serious crisis in the financial and economic sense. And in contrast to the distant past, the 1930s, when we came out of the Depression, where we had an enormous scientific industrial base and we could rapidly employ millions of people waiting for jobs, that doesn't exist in the United States as it once did. We've obviously shipped most of our industry out of the country, primarily to China and Mexico, other places. So it's not as though we can rapidly repatriate and put everybody back to work. And then, of course, we have the open borders crisis and the collapse of the rule of law in many of our major cities. Criminality is out of control. And every time someone attempts to enforce the law, it is the police that we attack, not the criminals who are responsible for most of the damage. So you have to view all of those things as the background or backdrop behind the conduct of what's happening in Ukraine. And inside Ukraine, we continue to shovel whatever we can in their direction, but it's quite clear that we've largely exhausted our war stocks. We don't have a great deal more to send in addition to what we've already sent. We can send some new weapons, but again, the numbers of new weapons with new kinds of missiles or rockets are very limited. We don't have huge stocks to back them up. And we now are beginning to get some truth through the American media. Even in the New York Times and the Washington Post, the word is creeping in that the Ukrainians have taken horrific losses. You see all sorts of estimates. Now in the West, people are saying, well, yes, they've had at least 100,000 dead. But truthfully, it's probably closer to 250,000 dead. And we just don't know, but we're beginning to see a lot of evidence that the losses on the Ukrainian side are far, far larger than anything we anticipated. At the same time, we've insisted repeatedly that the Russians were losing, that the Russians were incompetent, that they were stupid, they couldn't do anything. And still in many newspapers and outlets, you hear this business of, well, the Russians are stuck. There's not much more they can do. That too is beginning to break down. People are figuring out the integrated air defenses are exceptionally effective. Hundreds of aircraft have been shot down, 402 fixed-wing aircraft, 256 helicopters, Ukrainian aircraft, that is. So the notion that you're going to send a few F-16s, train a few pilots, isn't going to make any difference to where things are headed. And the Russian military establishment is now larger and more powerful and capable than it has been, certainly in 30 years. So all of the stated goals and objectives, harm Russia, degrade Russia, weaken Russia, all of this has kind of gone by the wayside. And then to cap it off, we have the visit of the Chinese premier to Moscow. And it's very obvious now that the Chinese have cast their lot with the Russians because thanks to all of our belligerent statements and activities in Asia, the Chinese have concluded that they're next on the menu. Under the circumstances, you might as well support the Russians. But we also misinterpret what the Chinese are trying to achieve. We don't seem to understand that what the Chinese want to achieve is this one belt, one road. In other words, they want to build rail lines. They want to move commerce and trade back and forth across Central Asia, through Ukraine, through White Russia, into Europe. And the Europeans, of course, ultimately want to trade with China. The only way to do that is to end the war in Ukraine. And the Chinese are very interested in doing that. That's one of the reasons they came to meet as well with President Putin. And before the Chinese have managed to do very much, we are instantly refusing any offer that might be on the table for an end to this conflict. And I think at the same time, inside of Europe, certainly in Germany, and I think to a large extent now France and other countries, people are beginning to say, wait a minute, how long does this take? How many more people have to die? What do we do with a state the size of Ukraine that is virtually destroyed? How do we handle it? How do we rebuild it? How do we repatriate millions of people that have left the country? All of these things are coming together, and that is your gathering storm, if you will. And at some point, the storm is going to break out. And I don't think we're going to withstand it very well in the United States because of our own problems. Well, behind the scenes, and we're talking about inside the Biden administration, there are voices that are arguing for a quote unquote off ramp, or is looking for an exit from this crisis. The problem, of course, is that President Biden and his principal cabinet members, along with large numbers of prominent senators and congressmen, have made very incautious, strident remarks, announcing policies that are extreme, from which you can't easily retreat. How do you retreat from saying that nothing can really end until this man Putin is gone? How do you retreat from our goal is to destroy Russia or at least harm it so that it, quote unquote, can never repeat what it is doing now? There is still no public discussion inside Washington of the alternative, which is what you've described, that this is unsustainable. It's also unnecessary. And we have no vital strategic interest that compels us to fight in eastern Ukraine. But we are hearing it now from potential Republican candidates for the presidency. Certainly DeSantis, who is seen as someone who could run for president, has made it abundantly clear that he does not support this current policy, that he thinks that we should, in fact, find an exit, that we have other more important issues, particularly here at home, our open borders and criminality and illegal immigration and so forth. President Trump obviously has always taken that position. Whether or not he will ultimately run, I don't know, but currently he's probably the favored candidate on the right. The larger problem politically in the United States is that people have lost faith in the institutions. A lot of people have very little faith in the elections because we've seen so much abuse of election legality. I mean, these absentee ballot things are ridiculous. You can stuff ballot boxes with all sorts of names. There's no way to track anything. If we see this kind of thing, and we're expecting to see it again, one wonders if we can ever have a free and honest election again that could result in any fundamental change in government. That's a very bad thing for American citizens to think, but that's where we are. So that the feelings in Washington, the thinking in Washington is probably more divorced from the broad base of American citizenry now than perhaps at any time in our history. Washington is indeed an island unto itself. People here do not feel the pressure that the downward spiral in the economy is applying to the public. There's no poverty in Washington. People have plenty of everything they want. The people who live in and around Washington are comfortable. The rest of the country is not. And as a result, people tend to look at the world as though this were 1990 or 91. Again, it's back to limitless resources, limitless capabilities. Our military today, in terms of size and in many respects capability, is a shadow of what it was 30 years ago. So the notion that our military can simply push buttons, launch missiles, and crush anyone that doesn't do as we would wish is fundamentally false. And then the other aspect, of course, is this financial system. We now have, as you pointed out, this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, that involves states all over Central Asia, now increasingly Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran. The Emirates are going to join, if they haven't already, India, perhaps Southeast Asian states, even states in Latin America, all because they want to get out from under the American-dominated and controlled financial system. Remember, all the major exchanges and transactions across borders have been for decades conducted in dollars. Well, that's been very beneficial to us because we can simply print whatever money we want to, and we pass our debt on to you. Those who don't normally trade in dollars, but have to if they're going to buy the various commodities. Well, this is ending because the Chinese, the Russians, and I think the Indians have collectively decided they'd like to transact interstate commerce in gold. And they have accumulated enough gold to peg their currencies to gold. So we have to stop and consider what this means, de-dollarization, the elimination of the dollar as the go-to currency for the world, not just as a reserve currency, but for the entire world. That leaves the United States, North America, Europe as still very dependent on the dollar, and certainly parts of Latin America and some parts of Africa. But what about the rest of the world? This is a huge development that's only just now beginning to be felt in the West. So all of these things contribute to what I think is the inevitable collapse of support for Ukraine, for this war in Ukraine. It will simply collapse. There's a famous American writer named Henry James. He ultimately left the United States, went back to Great Britain, and became a British citizen. But Henry James wrote a number of novels, and he was very famous for one particular saying: sacred cows are never slain, they simply vanish. And his point was, everyone expects a giant clap of thunder and things to collapse, when in reality, when things don't work anymore, in reality, there's not much noise. People simply walk away from it. And I think increasingly we're going to see people walk away from the United States, its financial system, its global grasp on the global finance, and walk away. It's already begun, and it's going to probably become a stampede over the next year or 2 years.